Hey y'all, back with another Spotlight with Context video. We're going over Beta Ray Bill today. Apologies, this is coming out a little bit later than I intended. Got a little bit sick, but gonna push through. Going forward, I think I'm probably always gonna skip the base health attack and PI. I'll call it out if somebody is top 5 in prestige, but otherwise, why bother? Why bother? Excuse me. So, focusing on the champion attributes right away. Survivability, we have a 3.5. This is an interesting one because it's kind of like averaging, I don't know, a 1.5 and a 5. There's not really much special about Beta Ray Bill as far as mitigating incoming damage, except if you're running recoil, right? Because he takes 50% reduced damage from poison as well as bleed. And if you have him at max sig, you can also play around recoil with him, kind of like Ghost versus Hood. That's a very high skill ceiling, so I wouldn't really rely on that. You can definitely get yourself in trouble. But you are going to be sitting on a certain amount of passive healing if you have that permanent poison on yourself, and that counts for quite a bit. When we combine that with his immunities to shock and just the fact that he is generally a large horseboy, he's going to do fine in the survivability department without really having abilities aimed at reducing damage. So, damage of 5, this is his whole thing, right? He just does an absurd amount of energy damage. It does rely on his shocks applying in the first place, but there are two different, very important caveats to that we'll get to. In my opinion, Beta Ray Bill only really shuts down if your opponent has very high energy resistance. Short of that, you don't need to worry. Ease of use 2.5. This is again somewhat of an average. You can play Bill pretty simply, just hit the opponent and spam special 1 and get decent results, right? You're going to benefit from a lot of the things he does, but at the same time, the upper levels of what he can do are extremely complex and require understanding the way that his kit comes together and timing things perfectly. So there is absolutely an upper level here to be chased. Utility of 3.5, the biggest thing here is the immunities. I know it bothers some of y'all that I do tend to count damage resistances and immunities in both survivability and utility, but I think that is correct as long as I'm not overrepresenting them in both places. But between the immunity to power drain and shock, the resistance to poison and bleed, the first anti-unstoppable in the cosmic class entirely in the form of his grit buff, the first use of a named type that counters glancing, this time specifically against Hex, but still, and the addition of a new anti-armor ability in Pulverize, as opposed to using armor breaks, and Bill has extremely relevant utility. You bring all that together with his damage, this is a very powerful attacker. Defender strength of 2, there's not a whole lot going on here. But there are some damage resistances which can slow down certain defenders. More importantly, his special 2 dex is pretty darn difficult. I'm not sure it is fully dexable. And when you combine that with the fact that under certain conditions it can apply shocks through block, and just the way that he responds to shocks in general, basically demanding immunity, there are some small threats, but that is not going to be the primary use of him, basically, ever. So moving on to strengths and weaknesses, we've already touched on most of these. You can see this section is pretty simple. Being immune to power drain and shock is great. Taking less damage from poison and bleed is generally great, but especially that poison synergizes really well with liquid courage. The grit buff is incredible. This is honestly something that I've been pushing for in the team to have anti-unstoppable in Cosmic. There have been a few places where the team has talked about it over the last year or so, but this was the first one that really made sense within the kit, and so here you go. Grit is the same effect that Shield has. It basically is what Valkyrie's Sig does, right? Valkyrie probably should have a Grit passive in there. Maybe that'll get changed at some point. But the important part is that this allows you to hit the opponent as though they were not unstoppable, even when they are. It is not ability accuracy based, and it does not require a debuff to stick to the opponent. So, very helpful ability there. It is a buff, so be careful against Mystics, but it's a Cosmic attacker. I don't know what you want. And then high damage. Like, Beta Ray Bill just does a ton of energy damage. Weaknesses, we talked about shock immunity. Shock resistance doesn't really block him out, and even shock immunity doesn't fully stop him. We'll get to this, but it's basically just energy resistance and shock immunity are both problems. Very high energy resistance is a bigger one. And then buff control. Everything he does other than his shocks does rely on getting those buffs up, and so you don't want to be losing them to things. Moving on to the actual abilities. For Always Active, we've already talked about this. Incoming bleed and poison effects suffer 50% reduced potency. As a reminder, this can then get increased by nodes, so this is not always half, but for something like Liquid Courage, this does mean you're taking half as much damage while healing just as much willpower as normal, so it's going to work out great for you. Bill is immune to both shock and power drain, and when the power drain immunity specifically prevents a power drain, he gains a power gain passive, giving a bar of power over half a second. This has a cooldown of 14 seconds, so you're not going to be able to spam special 3s with it, but this is a really nice trick in his toolkit for handling defensive power drain in tech. So you're looking at something like Viv, Future Ant-Man, if you do happen to hit Red Skull's block, although you still shouldn't. Any of those kinds of things are going to accelerate his loop, and if you play into that intelligently, you can definitely get some nice results there. When starting a fight against tech champions, or when immune to an effect, gain a steady buff for 20 seconds. So this steady buff is the new ability that prevents glancing. Unlike previous abilities, this isn't just you can't mess with the ability accuracy of my stuff. This is actually I cannot glance. So this bypasses the 50% weakness built into the effect. This bypasses the cannot crit clause. This bypasses the ability accuracy. It's all of them because it prevents the actual glancing. Now note that this is against tech champions, right? So you basically have to be fighting tech champions, or you have to be immune to shock or power drain on a regular basis. And obviously power drain in particular, you're most likely going to be immune to against techs. So this is pretty tech focused. It would be a little tricky to strategically eat a shock against, say, Storm X, so that you can then get this up and turn off her glancing. I wouldn't recommend that. But this is a very powerful ability all the same, because it's going to be fantastic, if nothing else, against future Ant-Man, and then just nodes and other annoyances. And then last thing here in the Always Active, the Thor Relic increases the potency of personal buffs by 25%. So this is just all the time. As long as you have the relic equipped, you don't have to jump through any hoops. You basically have a permanent and strong intensify. Alright, Call of Thunder. While charging a heavy attack, this is the core of Bill's kit. Like, the special one is the flashy cash out, but this is really what you're chasing to understand and to maximize Bill. So first off, he gets an unstoppable buff when charging a heavy. If he's struck while it's active, this goes on cooldown for 24 seconds, but it's important to remember that that's only if struck. And you can cancel out of a heavy charge either by letting it go and heavy intercepting the opponent, or by using a special as they're about to hit you. If you do either of those things, then the unstoppable doesn't go on cooldown and you keep benefiting from it, right? So if you play properly, you just have this safety net up basically all the time. But of course, what this allows you to do is that you can go for the heavy, and sure, you will have some ability to get out of eating a full combo and or a special if you're hit while charging the heavy. So that's the point of the safety net, because it's asking you to do some risky stuff, and it's protecting you while you are. While you're in the charge animation, all buffs on Beta Ray Bill and all shocks on the opponent are paused. So this just means that you're able to control the overall speed of your rotation by spending more time in the heavy attack charge, and you are not penalized for spending longer here waiting for your opponent to do what you want, which is important for reasons we'll get to in a second. Every 0.4 seconds, you gain a 20% intensify buff for 4 seconds that stack up to 5. His heavy attack can be charged for an extended duration, so you can just sit and stack these up. So some quick math here. Those intensifies stacking up to 5 means that you can increase the strength of all of your buffs by 100%, right? Everything is doubled. Except that the Thor Relic is also increasing the potency of personal buffs by 25%. Now, intensifies themselves do not benefit other intensifies. That's the only kind of buff they don't improve. But Beta Ray Bill's bonus for the Thor Relic does not ignore them. And so what that means is that 100% bonus you're getting from the intensifies is itself 25% stronger, assuming you're running the Thor Relic. So now you're up to 125% there, plus the 25% from that Thor Relic bonus, meaning basically every buff in this kit that has a potency specified, if you're playing Bill properly, is 2.5 times that strong, because it's getting 150% extra potency. So keep that in mind as we go, because that's really big for some of these. This next bullet has a number of clauses, but what it's saying is, while Beta Ray Bill has more than 2 bars of power, but fewer than 2 intensifies, the opponent is inflicted with an Intimidate passive. And when he gets to max stacks of Intensify, so reminder 5, then the opponent suffers a 10% Infuriate passive. So, couple things here. Basically, what this is supposed to do is that you only get the AI manipulation when you're at 2 bars of power, because that is when Bill most wants to cancel out of his charged heavy attack into a special, specifically the special 2, right? And what it's saying is that when you're already there, you get this kind of variable control. Odds are you are starting your heavy charge below 2 stacks of Intensify. So you get that Intimidate, the opponent is more passive. Then that probably buys you enough time, because reminder, you only need 2 seconds to get to the max stacks of 5 before you get there, and then the opponent gets this Infuriate and is more likely to charge in and allow you to throw your special 2 into their face. This requires a little bit of practice, but the AI manipulation does make it significantly easier. One thing I want to address now, because we seem to get some misunderstandings about this anytime we give anyone an Intimidate or an Infuriate, the potency of these effects is not the AI manipulation part, right? The potency of Intimidate and Infuriate is the block proficiency reduction and the ability accuracy reduction, respectively. Both of them have the same value for that aggression up or down for every single use of them throughout the entire game. They're all pulling from the same code. So I just want to clear that up now, because I've seen a lot of comments about, I just wish X had a stronger Intimidate or Infuriate like someone else. They're all the same. It's just context dependent, because reminder that these are not guarantees, these are biases. And so when you are biasing what the opponent is likely to do, that is within the context of what they were already going to do, or what is possible for them to do, right? So context differs on these things, but I just want to call that out. Like, His Intimidate and Infuriate are just as strong as everyone else's for the purposes of AI manipulation, despite the fact that you see 10% here on the info page. Now, what this has all been building up to, activating a special 2 while charging a heavy attack pauses all personal buffs until Beta Ray Bill has landed or been struck by 4 basic hits per intensify gained, up to a max of 20. So there's a lot to go through there, right? You can get a pause for up to 20 hits, but it's per intensify gained in that heavy charge, right? So if you are already at 5 if you are already at 5 intensifies, you release your heavy and then you go for another heavy and release that into the special 2, odds are you're only going to get 4, maybe 8 hits worth of pause, because while you will regain intensifies while at max stacks, you won't have gained 5 during that heavy charge. So to get the maximum benefit out of this, you do have to charge heavy for the full 2 seconds. You have the AI help to do that, but I just want to call out that wrinkle. If you do this, though, this is very, very strong, because it means that you have up to 20 hits, including, your basics and your specials, before you have to worry about those intensifies falling off, before you have to worry about the furies that you get later falling off. You just have all of these buffs, right? This will also pause the steady, that's your anti-glance. It will pause the grit. All of these things are great. But I want to call out some of the complexity here, because you'll notice this last line, the effect does not trigger if it's already active, and heavy hits count as 2 hits. So that means that there's kind of some play here, right? If you're trying to get back to another special 2, then you can't just spam heavies to get there. And you'll see why that matters pretty quickly when we get to the shock section, because there are incentives to not start your combos with mediums. And so the absolute upper limit on Beta Ray Bill's playstyle involves balancing like non-standard basic combos with heavies to try and make sure that this buff pause ends exactly where you want it to, so that you can then very quickly go into charging heavy, get your 5 intensifies, and reactivate it for the full 20 hits. And that way you only lose 2 seconds on all of your buffs that have just unpaused. Now, I should also call out, if you are starting your heavy charge at 5 intensifies, well, then you are instantly giving your opponent an infuriate. So that's also pretty difficult, which means that odds are that what you're going to be doing is waiting for the buff pause to end and then the intensifies to fall off, and then you're going to go for the heavy, which means that by the time the pause gets back up, you've probably lost 6 seconds, give or take. And so that does mean that I don't think it's actually possible, without just being absurdly lucky, to hold on to Bill's buffs permanently, but you can hold on to them for a very long time, which matters a lot when we get to the Fury, because he has a very large Fury, and so that's where a lot of his damage comes from. So I wanted to shout that out. You can do some nutty stuff by manipulating this pause. You also don't need to get good damage out of Bill in either short or medium fights. It's just this right here is what you want to understand if you are chasing his absolute limit. And then last bullet here, releasing the heavy attack grants a grit buff for 15 seconds. So important to note that to release it, you need to not just cancel it into a special from the charge. If you need the anti-unstoppable, you do have to actually throw the heavy attack. It doesn't necessarily have to hit the opponent, because you just have to release it, but you do have to take that risk of throwing it, whether you are just landing a normal heavy attack, intercepting the opponent with a heavy, and then canceling that into a special, although that doesn't give you the bonuses, right? The point here is that The heavy is very good for anti-unstoppable, but if you're trying to access the buff pause, which is a huge part of his kit, then you need to kind of balance these two. Now, armor pulverizer, this is what I called out earlier. I will point out, I understand that the word pulverize is used in Captain Marvel's kit, but this is different because that was just kind of a unique effect. This is a new named effect that you will see in other characters going forward. His first medium attack pulverizes one armor up effect, removing it and dealing a burst of damage. So you're not reducing the opponent's armor going forward like an armor break, but you are getting an instant cash out in the form of direct damage, and you are removing that armor effect without worrying about needing to apply a debuff. So it is quite good for all of that. And then, of course, if your opponent is armor break immune or resists armor breaks or anything like that, Pulverize doesn't have to worry about that because it is a new effect. Now, shocks. This is another big part of the kit. If your buff pause, meaning that pause for X number of hits you get from canceling the heavy into the special 2, if that pause is not active, then basic attacks have a 10% chance to inflict a shock passive, dealing a little bit of damage over 25 seconds. These effectively do no damage. That's not the point. That's also why they're passive, so they don't trigger willpower. And these max out at 12. This is not going to be a really important part of your ramp most of the time, because you might get all the way to the special 2 without ever getting one of these shocks. But any of these that trigger are just a bonus for you, right? So just treat it like that. During a combo started with a medium attack, or while striking the opponent with a special 1, the expiration of personal shocks goes faster by 285%. So this is very important because it means that you have control over when your shocks expire. That does mean that you can mess it up, right? You can potentially cause your shocks to expire too quickly or too late if you don't do this properly. But I already saw with the snippet of the deep dive shown in the live stream, people were complaining about, oh, I have to line it up. This is your control, though, right? If you just don't use your mediums indiscriminately, if you are deliberate about what combos you use, if you are deliberate about throwing heavies when it makes sense to gain power that way, it's really not that difficult to learn how many times you can start a combo with a medium and how long those combos can be for you to still have the shock expire when you want it to. Now, final hit of special attacks refreshes all shocks on the opponent. This is nice because it just means whenever you use a special, any shocks that are still there at the end, you get to hold on to, and you get to reset their duration so you don't have to worry about any of that maintenance you just did with your combos, right? All shocks are paused during the opponent's special attack, so you don't have to worry about that variable, and during Bill's special 2. They are obviously not paused during the special 1 because the special 1 is speeding up their expiry, and those two things can't coexist. But this does mean the special 2 is good maintenance because it pauses them and then refreshes them, so all of your shocks go back to 25 seconds. Now this is a big bit. When any shock on the opponent ends, deal a burst of energy damage. Note that this is not itself an instant shock. This is just energy damage. Meaning that if your opponent has resistance to shock, then they won't take any damage from the shock passives, but you don't care about that because most of your damage is going to come from this burst right here. This is why I said that I think the most important thing that Beta Ray Bill can't answer is actually energy resist, rather than shock immunity. Because whether the opponent's immune to shock or not, his real damage payout is energy damage. And right here, that's when the shocks end, but we'll see other things later. So notice that this says end, not expires. That means that if you do go over that max stacks of 12 on the shocks and you replace a shock with another one, that also counts as ending. So just want to call out that little wrinkle. And then we move on to the special 1, which is your payout, right? This was shown in the live stream. On activation, gain a Fury buff. for 15 seconds. These stack up to 3. Obviously, 15 seconds is decent for a buff on the special 1, but stacking them up to 3 would be tricky unless you're holding on to the pause, right? That's why I spent all of that time talking about how long you can hold on to your buffs theoretically if you play around the pause correctly, because getting 3 of these Furies is pretty big. Now, this Fury is itself 60% of Bill's base attack, right? But we already talked about if you have the Thor Relic and Max Intensify, the potency of every buff in this kit is increased by 150%. And if you multiply 60% by 2.5, you get 1.5. So each of these Furies is increasing Bill's attack by 150%. If you have 3 of these, you're getting an increase of 450%, and so Bill's sitting at 550% of his base attack. And then all of those shocks and bursts of damage when the shocks end are being increased by that much, right? Because unless we say something scales with base attack only, the default assumption is that it scales with modified attack, meaning that all of the damage numbers in this kit benefit from these giant Furies that you can hold on to for a very long time. So you definitely want to make sure that you have your 5 intensifies when you're throwing the special 1. Which is why you want them to be paused from the special 2, right? You're starting to see how things fit together. Bill looks really complex on paper, and again, the upper limit of his playstyle is incredibly complex. But these things also feed well into each other, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as we go. But during this attack, the special 1, the potency of personal bursts of damage is increased by 200%. So, flat out tripled on top of the increase from your attack being higher thanks to these Furies. While the personal buff pause is active, any shock ending on the opponent during this inflicts a personal shock passive. So this means that you don't lose any personal shocks that expire during the special 1, but it also means if for some reason you're having access to other shocks from a node or a hack or something, that those will then turn into Bill's personal shocks and benefit from everything in his kit looking for those. But basically what this is here for is you're trying to have all of your intensifies up, you're trying to get a big 150% Fury, and then you are trying to have all of the shocks from the special 2, which we'll get to in a second, expire during the special 1 animation, which is just going to delete your opponent. This is the big cash out. That's what you want to practice, is making sure that the shocks don't expire before you throw the special 1, but also making sure that you've burned through enough of their 25-second duration with your medium combos so that they do expire during a special 1. Okay, so moving on to the special 2, this is your ramp special, right? Because this is the one that you cancel your heavy charge into to get the buff pause. This is the one where you're probably going to be stacking up all your intensifies beforehand. This is the one that gives you a Energize, which can get you back to the special 1, and this is your guaranteed shocks. Remember, you have a very low chance on basics when the buff pause isn't active to apply those shocks. This is how you for sure ramp up. And then a reminder, at the end of the special 2, you're going to refresh all shocks, so you don't need to worry about anything falling off during it. They just all go boom, 25 seconds from the end of this. Now, first hit grants a 15% Energize buff. We already talked about this a little bit, but just to remind you again, multiply that by 2.5, right? So this is actually a like 37-38% Energize buff if you do everything properly, if you have the Thor Relic and you charge for the maximum amount of time. That's very strong, right? That is a lot of extra combat power, and that lets you get back to the special 1 quite quickly, even if you didn't save any power above 2 bars when throwing this. So that Energize is extremely important. And then all lightning hits inflict a personal shock passive, and then each Intensify buff grants a 10% chance to inflict these through block. That is pretty much just going to be a defender ability, and unless you are allowing Bill to charge his heavy for extended periods of time, that's probably not going to happen. But a reminder, this special 2 is a very difficult dex, so if you are facing Bill on defense, try and bait out the special 1, especially if he's stacking Intensifies, or bring someone with shock immunity. Because reminder, resistance isn't enough. If you're using somebody like Onslaught for that, and you stack up these shocks on yourself, yeah, they won't do any damage, but then when the shocks end, you still take the energy damage. So just calling that out. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the loop here, because the special 3 is just an alternate way to play. But we said all of these things fit together well, and I talked about how that happens. But just to give an overview, what you are doing here is you are probably not using the heavy at all at the start of the fight, unless you need the grit buff. And you run to the special 2. You charge heavy for as long as possible to get to your 5 intensifies. You intercept the now charging infuriated opponent with your special 2. That gives you a 37.5% energized buff for 15 seconds that is paused for your next 20 hits. You get guaranteed 4 shock passives. You might have a 5th or a 6th from the combos on the way up. And all of them are going to last for 25 seconds after you end the special 2. You are then going to carefully play through your combos and just build back up to a special 1, benefiting from the energize, probably starting a few combos with mediums to make sure that you're ticking through some of that 25-second duration on your shocks in preparation for the special 1, but not too many, especially if your opponent is doing anything to stall out the fight, because you need a certain amount of time left on them as you go into the special 1. Then you're going to throw the special 1. It's going to do a ton of damage, and this is where you make the call, right? If your opponent is dead because of the special 1, which is extremely possible because you just got a 150% fury and then tripled the burst damage from your shocks expiring, they might just be dead, right? But if they're not, now you have a choice. If this is a longer fight, you can try and do what we talked about earlier and make your way back up to the special 2 and try and get another buff pause and more shocks, right? So the next time you throw the special 1, you can get even more to end during that animation and do even more burst damage. Or you can go for another special 1, getting another boosted fury and boosting the burst damage from your shocks ending that much more because of your higher modified attack. But if you do that, it's going to be harder to then get back up to the special 2 before your furies and your energizes fall off. And that means that there's a chance that you might be starting over on that side of things. That might be okay as long as you hold on to the shocks, because reminder, they're refreshed at the end of the special 1, and you don't mind because you just got this big payout of, 2 fury buffs, filtering through 4 shocks, and now you work back up to the special 2 and try and go through that whole thing again at 8 shocks. But you can see how they're kind of branching roads in longer fights with Bill. Do you go for another 4 guaranteed shocks, or do you go for the furies right now? It's going to be a case-by-case thing, but that does mean that his ultimate ceiling is having 12 of his personal shocks from 3 special 2s, and 3 of those fury buffs from 3 special 1s. They don't have to necessarily be in a row if you are on top of the buff pause, but that's the ceiling should you choose to chase it. Most of the time, 4 shocks and 1 or 2 furies is just going to wipe out whatever's in front of you, so that is the main thing to focus on. But I want to talk through the decision-making process, because I don't think that this kit is super obvious on first read-through. It'll make sense as you start playing it, for sure. Now, Special 3. This is your alternate damage route. Gain a 100% resonance buff for 20 seconds, pause during special attacks. Resonance is to the reverb effect on North Star, as Overload is to trauma, right? This is very, very similar. This is just you deal 100% of damage dealt with your attacks as a burst of energy damage. So you get this for 20 seconds, it's paused during special attacks, and because it's a buff, it's also boosted by 150%. Meaning that if you set this up properly, then all of your hits are doing 2.5 times the damage that they themselves do as a burst of energy damage. So no shocks required at all. You can just go straight to the special 3, activate your buff pause with this so you get even more time out of the resonance, and then get your furies up from the special 1, because those furies are going to boost the damage your actual hits do, which is then going to lead to more resonance damage. So you can do plenty here even without shocks, but because this is energy damage, this is why I said Beta Ray Bill's #1 weakness is energy resistance, because he doesn't really have a way to cut through that. Now, moving on to the signature ability, the potency of personal bursts is increased by 40%. This is going to boost what he does when he pulverizes an armor up, which is nice. It's also going to boost what he gets when a shock ends, but it's important to note that this 40% is additive with the 200% in the special 1. And so if you're playing him properly and focusing on the special 1, this just takes 300% to 340% and isn't that much of an increase in damage output. It's still quite good, and it especially helps if you mess up the rotation, but just want to contextualize that properly. You also reduce the unstoppable cooldown by 10 seconds, so if you do get hit, even though that's what you're trying to avoid in canceling the heavy, if you do get hit, you get it back in 14 seconds instead of 24. That's pretty huge. That's more than a third off of the duration overall. And then while a personal unstoppable buff is active, damage taken is reduced by 100%. This does not reduce damage from the special attack 3, but this can be used to cancel out recoil. This can be used to basically help with a whole bunch of things. But I want to call out, reminder that if you get hit while the unstoppable is active, it goes on cooldown, and you don't have access to this. And the more you're using this, the more that you are probably charging the heavy 4.4 seconds or longer, meaning that you're sitting at higher intensifies, you're throwing more heavy attacks, you're burning through your buff pause because heavies count for more, and you are probably less likely to start a heavy charge while below 2 intensifies, meaning you're not applying that intimidate. You're more likely to be at 5 intensifies and thus apply that infuriate. And so it's possible to do some really great things with this damage reduction, and I'm not saying that anybody shouldn't do that, but just understand the risks you are taking, right? You are potentially interfering with the integrity of your rotation if you try and use this to cancel out giant damage numbers or recoil, and you are potentially using up your safety net when you otherwise wouldn't want to, which could put you in serious trouble the next time you have to throw a special 2, because instead of just taking a little bit of damage and then canceling into it, you might be eating a full combo. So use with caution, but it is obviously a very, very strong ability. And if you don't try any shenanigans with it, it just means that the safety net is that much better, right? Because then you don't take any damage at max sig while just sitting there charging, and that's great. Now, moving on to synergies, we have Cage Fighters with Hulk Ragnarok. Very good encapsulation of "you're trapped in here with me" energy. When rooted, either of these two characters passively gain up to the nearest bar of power over 1.5 seconds. It is removed if the root expires and doesn't trigger during the opponent's special attacks, but this does mean that as long as you can stay alive and unhit for 1.5 seconds, you can get around nodes like root or rooted or, Zemo's root by just dodging, blocking a little bit, and holding on until you get to your next bar of power where you can then cancel out of the root. So, pretty helpful. With Thor Ragnarok and Thor Jane Foster, Bill's special 1 has a 33% chance to inflict a stun debuff for 3 seconds. Not hugely helpful, but, shenanigans. Ragthor starts each fight with a Thunder's God Wrath passive for 10 seconds. That's what he gets from his special 3. 10 seconds doesn't last that long. It's not going to get you back up to another special 3, but this does mean you have access to that damage and that ability accuracy reduction right out of the gate. So that is a very good synergy for him. And then for Jane, if the opponent is not shocked, basic attacks have a 10% chance to inflict a shock debuff. It only lasts for 4 seconds, but if you play Jane, you know that this means you have potential access to those stuns and those guaranteed crits earlier. Galactic Breakout with Moondragon, Groot, and Captain Marvel. For Bill, the final hit of any of his special attacks pulverizes 3 armor ups, dealing more direct damage and generally just allowing you to chew through armor up effects faster. For Moondragon, outside of Psionic Transcendence, punishing the opponent's specials gives you 2 Mind Blast triggers, which allows you to ramp more quickly without worrying about accidentally pushing to the special 3. But the reason this doesn't work in Psionic Transcendence is that it would basically give you permanent uptime on her super mode. So it is more of a ramp accelerant than a maintenance synergy. Groot gets extra buff duration, but, until he gets buffed, who cares? And then for Captain Marvel, basic attacks have a chance to give you a persistent energy charge, which just makes her ramp that much easier. Anthropomorphism with Rintra, Spider-Ham, and Howard the Duck. First special attack activated by any of the 3 of them, or by Bill, costs less power, which is helpful to rotations. And that's Bill. Like I said, the kit reads a little complex. It can be difficult to see the through lines at first of how everything fits together, but it plays pretty well. It's a very powerful and fun kit. Lining up the special 1 to get the most out of your shock expiry is really fun. I think it's really interesting to chase maximum uptime on the buff pause and really go for those nutty numbers in long fights, kind of like Quicksilver. But in general, this is just a powerful character that does a lot of damage with really strong utility, and so is helpful on pretty much anyone's roster. I'm definitely looking forward to playing with Bill in-game. Hope y'all are as well. I know he's been much awaited, but let me know in the comments what you're thinking with this one. And I will be back soon with the Enchantress one, which will almost certainly be longer than this. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and take care.